Sean Robertson, lead artist. Pat Oliver, audio director. We'll leave Pat's picture up there for a minute while I just tell you what we're going to do today.
Thank you. Thanks for doing that, Julian.
Hey, he didn't get the joy of being up there for 10 minutes last year like you did. We're here today to talk about what makes for a really successful bad guy. We're going to walk through the process of building some of the signature BioShock Infinite bad guys. And some of them are pretty creepy, and some of them are pretty interesting and new, and we're going to talk about what went into the decisions to build those guys for gamers like us. We're going to show some concepts that didn't make the cut, and we're even going to dig into how Irrational uses sound to bring some of these bad guys to life. And we'll try to leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end before they kick us out of here to answer your questions. The good news is the panel after this got canceled, so even though it says 12:30, it doesn't mean the panel's half over. You're going to be able to run for a normal time. Before we dig into the first bad guy we're going to deconstruct, though, I kind of wanted to open it up to the panel and ask you sort of one overriding question, which is when you're sitting down here and you've got a level, you've got a concept, and you know sort of some basic story you want to tell, which is kind of where we were last year when we were talking about this, and you're going through the cast of characters, the bad guys that we're going to face, and you've got all of these lists of different things you want to accomplish. How do you know when you got it right? How do you know when you've got a bad guy that's going to work in the game?
It's definitely one of those things. I mean, it sounds a bit cheesy to say, but sometimes
Speak up.
when you see an image, you know it's right. There's a general consensus in some directors. Like sometimes when the image comes up, I can point at Boys of Songbirds image as one example where we didn't really do too many revisions on that. It just the image was there. I brought water to it, and we all took a look at it. So that's it. That's amazing. What can we do with that? Not all creatures have that aha moment. Some take a lot more blood, sweat, and tears to get going. But you know, there are the occasional moments where you just have a general consensus, like everybody on board. Let's go. Let's do this.
And do they tend to evolve a lot as you're building the game out?
Certainly, the other creatures that we have do have a lot of evolution. You know, a lot of revs as we go through. Like this isn't working. We got to change this.
Sure, because even if you we see that picture, for example, in Voice of Silence, you get that picture and you're like, oh man, we absolutely have to do this guy. But, it's sort of a case of, you can look at a picture of a pretty girl, but that doesn't mean you get to date her. You actually, as soon as you start trying to get some of these monsters in the game, you learn a lot about them and how they're going to have to change to be fun, to be scary. So there's you start with what's on paper, but then there's this massive evolution as you go.
So let's just dig into our first one. I want to start with this image that you guys showed me. And I didn't talk to you about most of these images, so I'm curious where they come from. This was the first image that I saw of what became the Motorized Patriot, that sort of George Washington guy with a giant machine gun. It doesn't look a lot like this, so who can
No,
Sean,
this is one of the first drawings I did for BioShock Infinite. And you look at the time period that we're dealing with, automatons were actually kind of a big thing back then. There's a lot of source material to draw from. And there's the reality of the automatons, which were these really, really creepy looking people that had plaster faces, that we had one motor that could do one thing, like pull a card out of a slot or something like that. And then there's the fantasy of what those people at that time would really have liked to do with it, which was creating these robots and automatons that could do things for you. So when we started playing around with the time period and knew that we wanted to go there, we started looking at automatons, and if you had unlimited technology at the time, what could they look like? And at this point, we're not even thinking about it as somebody that we're going to give a gun to. We're trying to build a vibe, and what's the history behind these things before they even get going.
This idea sort of stayed around. I mean, you drew this about
Yeah, it's really real.
and we didn't have Motorized Patriot until 3 years later. So because it's one thing to have an idea like, oh, we want an automaton, but then how does it thematically tie into what you're doing? And I think that's the struggle with everything we do. We can't just come up with a sort of creature in isolation. It has to sort of fit the narrative, fit the visual space and the aesthetic and all that stuff. And so there's a lot of ideas that some things happen right away, like the Boys of South, some things just simmer. years and evolved a bit.
Yeah, this image actually specifically comes from, it's kind of interesting to see this again because it was so long ago. This comes from a time in development when we just sort of go to our desks and start spitballing. We all draw, because we don't have a great sense of exactly where we're going at. So this is an image that comes out of that time when you're trying anything, you're trying everything, and it's just the beginning of the evolution.
So this was sort of a second, I'm guessing here, but when I was looking at these images, I was sort of trying to piece together how this might have flowed. This was sort of the second image that I saw in this evolution of the Motorized Patriot, where it seemed like this one had gone from sort of this feat idea of a gentleman to something that was starting to look slightly more creepy. What was the genesis of this version of the automatic gentleman?
Well, I don't think we actually had an idea for the function of him at this point. We just really liked the idea and just sort of let it run. Sometimes you come up with, oh, we need a monster to fill this gameplay role, or this, to be scary in this way. And sometimes you just keep riffing. This is artist Rob Waters. So, Sean planted the seed, we planted the seed of talking about these automatons, and he just kind of ran with it. There was a lot of iterations, literally hundreds of this guy, doing different things. In some cases, when we were stormy, the darker stormy game, which you may have seen clips from I think we showed last year, this guy had a huge weather vane on his head and could conduct that game and use that as a weapon, and we just tried a bunch of things.
This guy in particular, actually, the bottom guy that we bought, we were playing around with the idea of a town choir at the time. So this would be a guy who would, fictionally, not that even when you're actually playing Bioshock, you know what time it is, but fictionally, as people are walking around town, this guy would have the time for people and be able to tell, be informational, so that we're building a history for him before we make him a monster.
And then it seemed like that's when you gave him this thing. Right?
You always need one of those, right?
Right, and the next evolution was this guy, right, who seems like has that town crier thing going on, right?
He's a town crier, blow up dolls.
So what Ken, when you're looking at something like this, which is starting to seem like a pretty evolved concept, right? The guy's walking around with a gun on his chest, nice and creepy looking. You look at something like this, what makes you think, it's kind of where I want to go, kind of not where I want to go? How do you move from here?
Well, the challenge with a guy like this is, and look, I want to say a lot of this evolution happens just by, Rob Waters will sit there and just keep drawing. And sometimes, he'll just sit there and come up with ideas that along without any feedback at all. And I think he just kept coming back, and he's got an incredible amount of perseverance. I think that I would feel like very frustrated because he just keeps generating these beautiful images. But for me, I just didn't know how this guy, I love the look of him, and I didn't know how he fit in the world. I didn't know what his role was. And that's always the challenge, is how you integrate. How do you integrate these ideas? And so, we sort of go back to him and we say, hey, that's not exactly right. But generally, a lot of times we don't know what to tell him what to do. And he and Nate will talk, and Sean will talk, and they'll just keep evolving the idea. But look, probably a lot of the times is that I don't really know what I want at all. And so I don't envy his job. He's just got to keep at it, and keep at it, and keep at it.
Right, and then we go from, sorry, go ahead. We go from this to something that starts looking a lot more like what we saw in the trailers, which is this kind of George Washington-looking guy who starts looking really creepy. Is this about when you start realizing, hey, maybe we actually have a place for this guy in the game?
Yeah. This is sort of the image right that you start to turn a corner, and then the question was, he had the macro idea, then it gets down to the details. And something that I think that really came along with this guy. My mom had this doll when I was a kid that came from her. Her mother was probably born, her mother was probably born around 1900, I guess, my mom's mother. And she had this doll from when her mother was a child, that her mother handed down to her. And it was a porcelain doll that was probably made around 1904 or something like that. And we kept it in our dining room in our house. And that thing scared the fuck out of me. It had this porcelain face and those glass eyes and these rosy cheeks, and it just sat there like this. And I remember I had a dream one night when I was about 10 years old that I saw this doll sitting there, and I came down and I looked at it, and it was sort of looking away, and then all of a sudden the doll was like this. And oh my god. And this fucking thing was in my dining room. And so I had a sequel dream where the dog killed my mother. And went on and on, and so I'm still my mom still has this thing, I'm still kind of carrying that. And when we started sort of, one thing that I wanted to get is that porcelain, kind of cracking porcelain feeling. Because I always thought that was really this sort of uncanny valley kind of vibe. And this is what this is what I saw when I walked by the thing. It was, it's a little cute little girl doll. So all you can do is you try to tap into a bunch of things. You try to tap into the themes of the world, what's going on in the world, but then you try to tap in, because all you can do is like, what freaks me out, what scares me. And I think of all the images in my life, that was probably the thing that scared me most, was this little doll, which makes me like the manly man.
So you start looking at stuff like this, which seems like a really evolved concept, and you've got notes to sort of future artists about how to do things like pucker the eyeball socket and things like that. At what point do you take it from being on paper to things like this, which start looking like almost instructions to animators, right? And how to get this guy into the world and moving around and doing things. I mean, is that always part of this process, or is it sort of after you've decided, yep, we're going to do something with this?
No, I mean, Rob, it's definitely one of the great things about Rob is he really thinks mechanically about these guys, and he'll give you an earful about how he thinks it's supposed to animate. So he's definitely over there talking to animators, and he'll be over there minding stuff a lot of times. So if you go back to slide 13, I think you talk about the evolution. If you look at this, and he has the basic elements of what he has now, which is a flag and a machine gun. But if you look at where we went with him, we really wanted to push the patriotic feel. So instead of the tiny flag he holds in his hand, he's got two giant flags that stick out and change his silhouette. So that we're hitting our stride here with what we want to say with this guy, but it's not really fitting the aesthetic. So there's that final leap of, okay, I think we're getting all the elements here, we're just not highlighting the elements that we need. The creepy mask, the patriotism, the bright sunny day vibe that we're going for in Bioshock Infinite. Once we get there, then Rob's out there, doing his blueprints for us and constructing this. And these are his notes as much to the guy who's actually building the model as it is to the people who are in himself.
Right. Another thing, if you toggle between 13 and 14, that I think goes to sort of what our topic is today, which is, if you see one of the main iterations that caused the change, sort of the delta from 13 to 14, is we wanted the functionality to be both more visible, right? We wanted to see sort of how it worked, because we think that's more interesting. The other thing is, he essentially is a malfunctioning version of himself in the game. And we talk about fear and what generates fear. If you think of Hal or Ash or Bishop, there really isn't anything quite as scary as a malfunctioning robot, because there's nothing back there, right? Malfunctioning robots scare us in the way serial killers scare us, because we know that there really is nothing, there's no heart in there, there's nothing ticking inside. So when they come at you, you know that they're not going to stop, absolutely not stop until they kill you. And, I think that's one of the things he accesses. If he was a perfect working version of himself, it probably wouldn't be quite as scary.
Right, and that gets us to the really creepy version, right? Which this guy is definitely not factory spec. It's the idea here that, you break this guy down.
Yeah, well, this is the concept of, when you start shooting him.
Well, I remember there was a documentary, if you've ever been to the Hall of Presidents at Disney World, I think a lot of inspiration for this guy came from that. You have these sort of very kind of stiff, autonomous figures. But then I remember watching a documentary of, the 50s, a film from the 40s, but not 40s, the 50s, early 60s, when they were actually making these things. When you take sort of the mask off and you see sort of the workings underneath, it's kind of scary, because they're weird looking underneath all that stuff. They're just a bunch of gears and levers, because they're not, they've got a challenge of getting all these hydraulics, of getting all this stuff packed in this box where they don't care about the aesthetics. And seeing sort of what's behind the mask I think is always a good place to start to get change.
So let's look at where this ended up, right? This is a clip from the footage that we've sort of seen online. And clearly here he's in pretty good shape. He's got the flags behind him, etc. How do you go about integrating this guy into the world? Because I thought it was an interesting juxtaposition between this guy, who's clearly not your friend, and this, which sort of seemed like poster art that I imagine is a way we might encounter this guy in the world before we see him or after we see him, to give him a sense of what his true purpose might have been. How do you start integrating these guys into the backstory?
Well, it's always there. Like, I think it's actually the opposite. We integrate these guys into the backstory before we really think about what they are as a quote-unquote monster. These posters exist to tell the story of what they did in peacetime. I mean, the same way that Rosie in BioShock 1 has a rivet gun because she was one of the people that helped, she or it or he, was one of the people that helped build Rapture. And that's where that's why you have a person in a diving suit with a rivet gun walking around Rapture. It's the same way we look at this and we think about the function of this robot was to spread patriotism, to be the mouthpiece of Colombia for the citizens before things went crazy.
I think people probably think that storytelling is a lot more direct than it actually is. Like, until after a couple of weeks ago, I don't think I really closed the loop on this guy's role in the world from a narrative perspective, and it's mostly because it's a dialogue that happens between, the artists and the level builders, and all these opportunities come up. And if you're not there and you're not sort of hungry for those opportunities, we had a whole this level, which we haven't really talked about yet, where the Motorized Patriot, when we first meet him, and he was just sort of there. Like, he was like, oh, and then this robot comes out and starts shooting at you. And I didn't really understand thematically why I was there, and sometimes you have to trust yourself, and you get this really weird place where you're like, he's there, but it just feels like he just feels tacked on, and I sort of knew his purpose, I knew his role in the world, but why was he in this space? When you met him, when you met Sandra Cohen, you knew why he was in the space he was in. When you met Steinman, you knew why he was in the space he was in, but before Steinman was Steinman, he was just
Crazy.
Dr.
Grossman.
This doctor, and then you start figuring out what is his purpose here? Why does he live here? What does he want? What's his goal? And finally, actually, it's really about a week and a half ago where I think we really closed the final loop, and that's because it's not just sitting there and staring at the wall. It's Nate will come up with something, Sean will come up with something, or have a sound effect, or Rob will do a new image. Or some programmer will come up and say something, and that's the joy of working on these games, is you're just surrounded by smart people, and you get to go to work every morning, and these, I know there's gonna be 1,000 violins playing for me right now, but making games is hard work, and there are a lot of times you come to work, and you're like, oh my God, do we have any fucking idea what we're doing? Because you have this track record that the company has. You kind of go, well, do we really remember how to do any of that? Because it gets very opaque, very murky, how you go down a path. And the way to do it really is just to not worry about it and to trust that if you're surrounded by really smart people and you have enough time, you're going to come up with something that's interesting. And because there's no overlord sitting over this, figuring this out and passing it down. It's a bunch of people collaborating and just sort of figuring it out as they go along.
So let's move on to a different image. Let's talk about the Handyman for a second. Again, you guys were generous in dropping a whole bunch of artwork on the Handyman, and most of us probably saw him in the trailer for the first time, and he's kicking your ass the first time you see him. And this is the first image that I got to see of the guy, which is not exactly the most threatening thing. I mean, to me, this is a sad picture more than anything. I mean, what's the thinking behind creating this kind of, I don't know, ecology for the guy before you even got into the game?
I was lucky enough to have a chat with Guillermo del Toro on our podcast, and one thing he said I thought was really brilliant was that a good monster is a monster you can imagine in repose. And what I think Guillermo meant by that is that the monster has to have a life besides wanting to fucking kick your ass. He has to have a story, and an existence besides what he means in that gameplay moment when you encounter him. And I think that's what makes great villains in general. If you look at, whether it's what's Day-Lewis's character in Gangs of New York? Seeing him in his environment, in his milieu, before he's fighting, before he's killing people. Seeing villains need time to develop and need time to breathe, and to get there, as game creators, we need to start imagining, what this guy's story is. We're not actually going to talk about what this guy's story is today, because it's not like you waited an hour and a half to see a panel, you want to learn anything interesting. Because I'd much rather you guys sort of encounter it in the game, because but figuring out these images really help us sort of evolve, a sense of this guy's life and a sense of what he's doing when he's not attacking.
Yeah, and I think for us, it dates back all the way to System Shock 2, that I think even though we may start with different intentions, we always end up injecting some amount of pathos into our monsters. If some older members of the crowd who played System Shock 2, you remember that our sort of rank and file enemies, the hybrids, would actually apologize as they were attacking, because they were so half-conscious, even though they were taken over by the many. They would both attack you and apologize, because they were literally being animated to attack you. And, it started there for us, and I think in every enemy, we found that little bit of, you can also feel sorry for our enemies as they're killing you. That's an important thing.
I think I remember writing that AI video for that character. An AI video it's sort of tap lines for a monster. And generally, they're not, they're like, flank him, get him, go around the back. And it's the hardest thing to write because it's so boring. And I remember starting to write this guy, and I was looking at him, and he's just, he's like this 120 polygon character. And I was like, how can we make this interesting? How can we make this character interesting? And then I remember just the word run, came into my head, and that this guy would actually warn you about himself, and their sense of that shame, and that sense of, and he's fighting within himself, which is that one word, and that gave these guys a life beyond, what their 120 polygons allow. And I think that set for me as a writer, set the tone for a lot of, for System Shock, for Bioshock Infinite, for how to think about AI VOs and how to make them more interesting besides just the information that they project to you.
So I want to move, and we won't linger too much on this, but I wanted to look at some of these sort of early pictures of the Handyman and how you're sort of trying to keep that pathos in. And I looked at the images like this and the previous one, where you sort of see him in this quasi-cowering position. And I was wondering, from an animation and an AI perspective, it's one thing to draw a character that looks sympathetic or give him sympathetic lines. How do you go about actually making the guy act sympathetically in environments like this?
Certainly from the animation side, Pat and his team did this amazing treatment of the Handyman, in the world, and coughing, it's really wet type of cough, and we heard that and immediately wanted to do an animation to fit that, and it was one of those cycles where we do the animation and it feeds back to the sound department. It's definitely one of those moments where working across departments when you start to actually get this character moving in the game, it really helps get the creative juices flowing.
Ken talked about how the Motorized Patriot didn't really have a home in the level that we were introducing him in. One of the ways I think that you develop that sense of empathy for an enemy is really about how you introduce him. Because once he's been introduced as a game mechanic, his storytelling powers kind of go out the window. He's now about, he's really now about somebody who wants to kill you and you want to kill him. So you have an opportunity when you're introducing these guys to just inject, that's really when your narrative window is.
So just a couple more quick pictures, because I just think people may enjoy seeing them. Again, like we saw with the Motorized Patriot, I sort of thought of this as the parts sheet. Right? I imagined getting this guy in a box and trying to build him as a model. Is the intent here to really be sort of creating a reference diagram for everybody who's going to be in?
Well, it's funny is we never asked Rob to do these. He just gets so pissed when people model his monsters wrong. So he'll do 8 pages of this, and like down to the tiniest detail. And like I've seen things where he actually goes and gets reference of what the head of the screw should look like.
He'll build it with skeleton.
Yeah, but I love this one where we were looking at the actual actual finger proportions of each knuckle to each finger, right? I mean, I wouldn't expect to see this in concept art as much as I'd expect to see it in the first model.
Yeah, sometimes you'll get a difficult mechanic and they'll just build it in Sculpey. They'll plop it on the modeler's desk and say, here, this is what you do went wrong.
I mean,
This is fun.
I mean, do you ever need to get to the point of like doing it almost like you do film, where you're doing full maquettes and stuff like that, or does the digital world give you so many more tools to do that?
Yeah, we can do 3D maquettes like much more quickly, and we can iterate on them more quickly. But sure, we effectively do that. And drawing systems are incredibly hard to operate. So,
Right. And in case anybody missed it, this is where we ended up. Right? This is as we see him in the game, looking a lot less sympathetic to me, honestly. So I wanted to move on to some of the newer, the newer bad guys, if you will, ones you guys have just started showing. I wanted to talk about the Siren. Right? The Siren is the last one that you guys did video on, and she's this diaphanous creature who hovers over the battlefield. And this is the image you guys gave me to start with.
Looks like a fun guy.
It doesn't quite look like that. So I was hoping someone might give me some context.
Well, you know, when we're doing these sketches and looking at concept art, you're trying to figure out how does this guy fit into your world that you're creating. Because concurrent to this, you're building levels, you're doing environment concept art, you're actually building environments, and you have the whole story arc that you're trying to tell. So this guy might work great in another game or another story, but in the story that we're trying to tell, we start going through these things. So this guy really doesn't fit the feeling that we're trying to get across with this particular person or this particular level. So it could be, you know, something as simple as that. Like, it's just not right for where we want to introduce this character.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we have is that we try to limit the number of supernatural elements in the game. We try to like basically say, make one logical leap in each game. And Rapture is, you know, there's this genetic technology. Yeah, there's a city at the bottom of the ocean. At least that's, you know, conceive that you can sort of see how that could potentially happen. Because once you just sort of throw the rules away, I think you start losing people because they can't buy into the world. So we wanted like people to be an enemy. So like we have this desire from the design team to have a character who raise people from the dead. But how does that fit into what we're doing? And we start getting all these images of like these, you know, very fantasy-like characters magically raising people from the dead. And that, unfortunately, how do we tell that story? How do we make people, how is that consistent with the world we're trying to create? And a lot of times we do that just by, you know, and poor Rob, we're not telling him how to do it, like we don't tell him where to go with it, but he just keeps sort of throwing ideas down.
And yeah, this is one of his ideas. This is sort of like, or the previous was, he was sort of like a Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God. And he would, you know, he had stigmata on his hands, which would shoot blood and raise guys up. And it just, you know, it wasn't really a fit for this game, but it's an interesting idea.
It's a great idea.
Yeah.
But so then you make this logical leap to not have it be Jonathan Edwards and sinners in the hands of an angry God, but instead this performer. You know, and how does that? I guess how does that make it a better fit to the world at that point than Jonathan Edwards?
Well, you know, as you evolve it, you're still thinking about like how is she? There's two other things you have to get. She has to look cool, and she has to look interesting, and she has to look different than every other game. She has to fit the world of Bioshock Infinite, and somehow, not only do we have to have a story that's believable, then we have to have a way to convey that backstory. Because if you can't convey the backstory in any way, like to the average gamer, we can always write a log, you know, or an audio log. But that's cheating. You know, that really is very, you know, maybe a lot of people in this room read that stuff, but you know, I can't count on the fact that most gamers who play Bioshock are going to really dig that deep. We call those people like probably a lot of people in this room. We call them the archaeologists, the people who are going to dig really deep and want to get every nook and cranny. And we love that. And you guys make my job so much easier because I just, you know, write, you know, 3 sentences and everything is explained. But we try to find ways to get the idea across visually. And so if you never read an audio log, at least you have a pretty good understanding of what's going on in the game. And that's why the visual is so important. And so at this stage, we're still looking at what's cool of you. But we haven't sort of tied that into any story. Like, why is this woman raise people from the dead? I don't know.
Why is she sitting around in her underwear?
Or like But then you get to things like this, where it starts to seem like, ooh, this is cool, right? So is the point here now that you've got this mechanic in place, you know you want this resurrector type in the world, and you're starting to get somewhere where you're like, now I can see this person in the game?
Yeah, well, there was a movement in the turn of the century, this spiritual movement, where there was a real belief that there was and amongst actual scientists, that there was a thing called the ether, and that there was an ability for the dead to communicate through, I don't remember they communicate through the ether, and there was, what was that material called?
Ectoplasm?
Yeah, ectoplasm. And do you remember more of the, because we certainly passed this a little bit, do you remember the details of this?
No, I mean, it was a really strange movement. Actually, a lot of people got involved with it. Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of Sherlock Holmes, kind of ruined his career.
Harry Houdini was.
Yeah. There was members of the Royal Academy, which is the most prestigious sort of scientific organization in England. Several members of the Royal Academy got completely into it and ruined their scientific careers. So this wasn't like necessarily edge science back then. They thought that, they were just getting, they were learning about electricity, electromagnetism, or something. And when you learn about stuff like that for the first time, the other stuff doesn't seem particularly far-fetched. You're seeing some of the most incredible things you've ever seen from technology, and I think it's interesting. I think actually technology made, the ethereal and those sorts of things actually more believable to people of that time, especially legitimate science.
Because you think guys like Lister, the guy who sort of discovered germ theory, that he told his colleagues about, there are these invisible little monsters, and they're killing people. They thought it was fucking crazy. And he Listerine is named after this guy. The notion that you should, doctors, when they're doing surgery, and before the 1870s, 1880s, they would do one surgery and they'd sort of wipe the blade off on their coat, and they move on to the next one, and people generally die all the time in surgery. That's generally what killed people, is the infections afterward. And so guys like that would come along and say, there are these magical little creatures that are killing people, and we need to, dip things in alcohol and find what was that? Well, there was a substance they were using as an antiseptic that was like carbonic acid. Right. That had its own, beyond kill people in different ways, but then you have, like they were saying, people were talking about there are radio waves, and later on there are microwaves, and all these invisible things that exist in the air that we had no idea about. And you start seeing how these sort of ghosts and flying around the air that you can't see, and their ectoplasm, and all these other sort of fantastical elements might seem very believable. So then you start trying to find ways to ground it in the reality of the time. But then you sort of have to and you saw a lot of images. There's a whole field of photography, this sort of ghost photography that would happen, where they'd actually show, they show pictures of a seance, and they'd have these, and because remember, people didn't really understand photography that well, either the audience didn't understand photography. So right now, if you looked at it, it'd be very crude looking. You see this sort of overlay of this woman dressed up in an outfit, something like that, standing over the table, and they'd sell that as, this is an actual photograph of a ghost. And now it's obviously just somebody just did an exposure or a double exposure. But this is sort of the look that you started seeing evolving. Theatrical.
Right, and then we end up.
That's pretty much where we landed.
Yeah.
Right, and the mystery of the shrouded face too is something that definitely appealed to us. I mean, just adding more mystery to the character and pulling back from defining it on the screen is definitely appealing to us.
Right, and an interesting juxtaposition to somebody like the Motorized Patriot that's in a way all face.
Yes.
Right? All right there in front of you.
We don't have the videos, do we? Because if you watch the videos, she's all about movement, she's all about sound. Unfortunately, she is not particular, her pixels on her body, it's real about special effects.
Good segue, Ken. Because next we're gonna talk about some sound effect stuff, which I'm really excited about. We're gonna dig into the Voice of Silence a little bit. These three images we have on the Voice of Silence aren't new. They were featured in the video that you guys did on the Heavy Hitters. Maybe just a little bit of backstory on where these guys came from. You guys mentioned that this was a set of images that you saw and immediately were like, we got to do something with this. What was the thinking before you started getting to the sound design of what these guys are going to do in the world and why people should care about them or be afraid of them or want to be attacking them? Ken, maybe?
Is this
forget a role type, basically, design and spec. They're trying to think of interesting new monsters, basically. And so they write these specs, which are essentially like, here's what this monster does, here's how he attacks, here's how he moves, but it's all very nebulous, and there's no description whatsoever of what they look like. This enemy's role on paper was he could absorb sound, specifically the sounds the player made, either by running or shooting or blowing things up. And the more sound you made, the more he would collect, until he reached a breaking point when he heard so much, he'd open his mouth and basically fire out a sonic weapon of all the sound he collected. So obviously, like, what you really wanted to do was be extremely quiet about this guy.
Yeah, and it made you choose your weapons differently because, you know, all of a sudden the volume of the weapon, it made him more powerful.
So you walk instead of sprint, you stick to carpets instead of tiles, things like that. Turned out it didn't work that well in the game before, so it's actually really difficult to communicate with the players. Often they couldn't see him, that they were, that they were potentially doing damage to themselves by making noise. It was very difficult to communicate. We loved him so much that we basically we went recruiting for a job for him, and because there was absolutely no way we were going to get rid of him. It was too cool. I can't wait to see you guys dressed up as him.
So when the guys sitting next to you.
So yeah, we went to the game and we found a role for him. Probably not going to get into exactly what that role is, but
no. But Pat, I wanted to talk to you. You've now got this guy in front of you. You've got great images like this. You've got some ideas on his role. How do you start the process of saying, well, what does it sound like when a guy absorbs sound?
Sure. Well, this is something that our senior sound designer, Jeff Seamster, worked on this character for kind of a while. We would talk about it for months and months and months before we even played anything for Ken. And we always knew that what was important to sell was this character's effect on the world. So as Nate was sort of talking about the early prototypes of this character, we would sort of dynamically take sounds that are playing in the world and start to remove them, like ambience. And even with that kind of sonic feedback, we were having difficulty feeding back what this character's effect on the world actually was. And I remember the very first prototype that Jeff designed. I think you have that, right? That audio file?
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and try to play a few of these sound clips and see whether it works. Pardon the blank screen for a second. So this is what you call the early concept.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and play that again. Just so what the hell is that?
So when I was working on early Songbird prototypes, actually, we brought this metal singer. She screams, I guess, that I had made games with in the past, named Malika, into the studio to sort of scream for us. Have you heard it? No, that's from Malika. Yeah, Helen can scream too. And I was sort of playing around with sort of more feminine textures when I was designing Songbird, and this sort of source never really made it all the way through to the Songbird prototype, and we just had these audio files laying around in the studio for a really long time. And when Jeff and I were talking about the design of this character, we both sort of immediately were like, that would be a great source to reach for. And I think Malika, her sort of, the texture of her voice, it's really rough and grainy, and that's the element that sort of stayed from the early prototype through to the final sound, which you can listen to.
Let's go ahead and listen to that one.
So I think the problem with like the early prototype, when Jeff and I would sort of talk about it, and Ken, was that it was really disembodied, right? It's a really wet sound, which audio people use that term to describe something that's very affected. So it didn't really sound like that sound was coming from this body, and it's actually difficult as a sound designer to sort of sell the size of a creature that's relatively small given the sonic impact it has in the environment. And I think Jeff did a really great job with that sound, where morphing a human element into a series of sound effects to sell this character's effect on the world.
I mean, we'll play it again in a second, but I was listening to this last night again, and one of the things that I was trying to imagine was looking at this character and hearing the sound, and the thing that I immediately got was, holy cow, there's all this metallic stuff in it that, of course, I'm sure you were thinking of, because he's got these giant freaking horns on his head, right? That wasn't in there before. But let me just play one more time. You might hear what I'm thinking. That sort of ringing sound.
And I don't know who did the animation for this, but it was really inspiring for Jeff and I to sort of watch the animation of this character. You may have seen it in the trailer that came out recently. This is the pose of it, where the Voice of Silence just sort of reaches its hands back violently. And it's another one of those sort of evolutions, right, where Rob Waters comes up with a 2D image, and that inspires the art team to model its character, and then the animation team gets in there and sort of gets some movement on the character, and the sound team gets behind what the art team is trying to sell, but also we sort of will watch a video of a character with no sound, right? That's how we get these characters. There's absolutely no sound. And we don't want to sell just what the art team is selling, because you could play the game on mute then, right? So I think Jeff did a great job of selling not just the movement of this character, but also the character's effect on the world and how powerful he is. I love that sound.
Ken, I wanted to ask you in this process when you're doing sound, because we talked about this a little bit before. At what point are you either providing direction or getting real feedback? I mean, are you hearing these sounds often for the first time when you're seeing an animation of this character doing, his shtick, or are you listening to sort of sounds in headphones with a blank piece of paper in front of you?
It's a process. I think on this guy, I think we had. Did you have an animation first?
Yep.
And you played that first sound. Correct. And then we talked about it. So I see it, I trust these guys to, it's talking about sound is a little tricky. Like, how do you describe the sound you want to make? So you have to really, sound especially, you really have to surround yourself with people you just have a huge amount of faith in. Because the feedback I'll give you, I remember we were working on Bioshock 1 on machinery, like the circus values machine and stuff. And, the original cast was much more sort of sci-fi.
Correct.
And, we just had a conversation about, we sat around and talked about how machines worked, because you can't really talk about sound in a very, I can't be like, it should be more like, that's not going to work very well. And so, we just have to talk about concepts, and a guy like Pat is going to go off and use that vague direction, go into research, and actually collect a library of sounds, because it's always very easy, I think, to slip into science fiction with sound effects, and the more you can ground it in, like you said, there's a sound of metal, coming out of that. I think the better off you are, because it just makes it sound much more believable.
Yeah, I mean, another thing to point out about the audio team is that these are a bunch of guys who love sound. I mean, real sound, the sound that things make. And, it's kind of funny to see how they sort of operate and detect sound in the world. And you get the sense that they live a very different life.
I find him upstairs just rubbing 2 blocks of wood.
So I wanted to do one more quick hit on the sound front, and then we'll open it up for some audience Q&A before we wrap up. I wanted to talk about the Songbird, which I think is the first thing many of us saw at all Bioshock Infinite. This is an early piece of, I'm guessing this is an early piece of concept art?
This is actually like, we were talking about the drawing before. We were shooting in the dark, Rob, with all the concepts we were having of what we wanted the Songbird to look like. And this was a drawing that Rob just did and kind of threw into the pile. And it was one of those, oh my God, like this is fucking it. This is what we're doing.
That's what he looks like.
Yeah.
Well, I think the reason this works so well is it wasn't just about a monster, it was about a relationship. And I think also for me as a writer, it told me so much about the relationship, seeing that. And I think Rob tuned into the emotions of that relationship and therefore found the character at the same time, right? Because he wasn't working in a vacuum.
Well, and it's 2 relationships, right? Because this is the other relationship of the Songbird, right? Which is not nearly as loving and protective as the one we saw in the previous image. And so there's multiple things going on with this character. And very early on, we as gamers got to hear the early sounds. So Pat, set us up for the early Songbird clip we're gonna hear.
So when I first started working on the Songbird, like a number of things sort of unlocked for me, and one of the things that unlocked was I was making a set of assumptions. The first assumption I made was that it had to have a voice. So when I first started working on it, before you even heard it, I was like, Songbird's not gonna have any voice at all. So you're just gonna hear the Songbird's effect on the environment and its movement set. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie WALL-E, but I wanted to restrict the palette that I was playing with to just the Songbird's movement set. And once I got those sounds in, I sort of found that I was missing a layer of expression. I couldn't really communicate like jealousy and anger and happiness and all these emotions that Ken's playing with when he's writing a scene. So I then began to just sort of scream in the studio. And the source of the Songbird's cries are actually, just me screaming.
Should we play that first clip?
Yeah, sure.
That's you. So you got, and obviously it was in a scene, right? So we were hearing other sounds as well. We were hearing Elizabeth breathing.
Sure.
Are you often working with a scene while you're trying to develop that first sound, or are you working more in a vacuum?
I worked in a vacuum for a really long time before we were working on the E3 demo, this is the sort of first time you probably encountered the Songbird, which was in the E3 demo in the curio shop. I'll start concepting a character kind of early, right? Because we're all working in parallel. The animation team is working on getting this character moving, and design is working on how the character is going to be in the space and what their gameplay mechanics are. And I sort of have to start concepting characters before I see any of that, right? But this particular scene was pretty special because me and one of the artists, Steven Alexander, worked on this scene pretty extensively, and it got to the point where he was giving me sound feedback, and then I was able to actually start to drive some of the timing of when the visual effects were playing. And that's one of the things that I think is pretty special about prototyping some of these characters at Irrational, is that a lot of the developers think more like storytellers before they start thinking like an artist or an animator or a sound person. And we sort of collectively drove that scene.
So let's see where we ended up. This actually does something a little bit different.
Nice. Listen.
So one thing I was thinking when I was watching it again last night is for a character that doesn't have a voice, there's an awful lot of voice going on there, right? We've got a couple different emotional contexts in the cry. We've got that breathing, which was totally absent from your early work. Are you taking those cues from the scene at that point where it's like, okay, what are we communicating about the Songbird at this point?
Yeah, so at every sort of stage in that scene that Ken had written, the Songbird is entering different, layers of aggression. He's suspicious, then he's aggressive, and then he's frustrated when he gets the scene. So the dramatic pacing of the scene sort of pushed me as a sound designer to come up with a vocabulary for all these different emotional states. And the sort of end result, right, which is a scene where you're hearing the songbird vocalize, you're hearing the songbird breathe, you're hearing the songbird move, you're hearing the songbird's effect on the environment with the rumbles and the vases falling off of the shelves right before he arrived. You sort of are hearing my entire process, which is I originally started with no voice and just movement and just the character's effect on the world, and then I added in voice, and then I added in the songbird breathing, and I think that the process of like not making any assumptions about how something should sound based on my own sort of sonic prejudices resulted in a character that is pretty strong.
Yeah, for sure. So we have about, we are running through into nebulous time because there's no panel in here right after us. We're going to do about 10 minutes of Q&A before we wrap up. So trust everybody to keep their questions on topic.
Until they're all just about finished. And people working on narratives, unlike gameplay where you sort of have this very iterative process and like, well, the guys are shooting at me and you sort of tweak a few knobs and make a few levers. Not that that's easy, it's just that you can see the progress a lot better. Gameplay sequences are terrible. It's really just about done. Like, we just had a scene which we got that right now. You know, it's just, finally somebody who's not one of us can look at it and see where it's going. But our job, and I think the difference between a amateur and a professional, is really somebody who can see through all the, like we'll do a scene like Liz's head will all of a sudden spin around, or, all the lighting is wrong, or she's not looking at you. Like we we'll see right
Or it's a beautiful scene and she's crossing it.
yeah, she's completely cross-eyed. It's incredibly distracting. And as a professional, you have to really strange looking sometimes, and you just have to sort of look past that.
It's like speed dating. You have to look past it
and see where it's going.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was wondering for each of the panelists, if you could set a game in any historical period, when would you set it and why?
I'm thinking 1912.
1912, that's awesome.
For us, I think, while I don't think we would necessarily restrict ourselves to doing historical games, again, we have a real interest in a broad swath of history. And, I think we'd be game for anything because, what a time period brings with it is really a whole set of technologies and language and culture and clothing, and all those things are really enticing when you dig into them, especially if they've been untapped for so long in a game. And that's one of the fascinating things about doing games in the second period. The period itself is never as important as sort of what it culturally and spiritually brings to the table.
And there's another great thing is like almost all the posters in BioShock 1, like a lot of beautiful paintings, were images from orange crates. There was like this whole beautiful art form on orange crates and fruit crates for the period. And you can just steal the shit, which was great. It was really cheap. And so there are advantages you get, but it just informs. Periods really inform you and give you a real great head start.
Thanks for your question. I'll let the folks wait at the back of that line know. We'll probably only do maybe 4 or 5 more questions before we need to move on. So that's a flow into as well.
Sorry.
What's that?
Go ahead.
Hey guys, I kind of want to talk to you about the concept of escalation and how do you take, and do you take the lessons you've learned, the kind of choices you made from previous games, BioShock 1, and kind of push them forward? Do you use the lessons you've learned, or do you build on the concept you developed for the earlier games for this new game or stuff you might do in the future, or do you kind of scrap everything and start fresh and end up rotten?
I wish we could learn more. There are many lessons there that sometimes even we don't abide. Like lessons we've learned before. That's part of the fun for us. Is we approach every game I think uniquely. It takes so long, and you forget so easily the difficulties you ran into, or it is possible to go running up the same hill again, only to realize that you failed at it in the past. But that's part of challenging yourself.
Yeah, but not learning our lessons would mean that BioShock Infinite would be based underwater
Yes.
Next question.
I just had a question about the wood silence there, face. Why did you make the choice to make the nose main, like a predominant feature and so large on the face and not just kind of make it tiny, cut it out, even though it's not really part of it, that monster's character?
Only Rob would know.
Yes.
Actually, I do believe the helmet idea, Rob always, one of the first things he does is he takes tons and tons of references. A lot of times he doesn't show it. That there was a similar helmet, it wasn't from Handyman, I don't remember what it was, that he used as jumping off point for all this stuff. I don't know, I mean, I think, at least we agree that there's something about that head works. And I believe there are iterations with that nose, but something about like the screen, big nose, simply rendered as just it works visually. Sometimes you can't tell. Sometimes you just land on it.
Good to get lucky.
Yeah, you do get lucky.
My question is about the sound. I'm glad you actually brought up Wall-E because I've seen a video on the sound design for that movie, and I know that every moving part of that robot has its own distinct sound. So, how do you decide what you can get away with leaving out of the game that people may not notice as far as ambient sounds go?
Okay, yeah. I think that that's a pretty astute question, right? So I think that a mistake that a lot of early young sound designers make is that they want everything to have a sound at all times. And something that I think Ken's really great at is sort of directing a scene and distilling it to the sounds that you need to hear in that particular moment. So at any point in that scene when I'm driving it, and I drive the scene when the Songbird isn't visually in the scene. I have as much time as Ken and I think I have to play with. We're making like conscious choices, every second of the way. Do I want to hear like this explosion, or do I want to hear the Songbird walking? Do I want to hear the Songbird's footstep land? How long does that sound? Is it 1 second? Is it 2 seconds? Is it 3? So it's an iterative process where we'll look at a scene and you only need to be hearing what's most important. So in those scenes, you don't hear much ambience because that's not what's narratively important in the scene. Songbird is sort of taking center stage.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi there, guys. Big fan. One of the themes that I've noticed from like BioShock 1 and System Shock is that you guys would take something heroic or beautiful and ruin it. There's a big theme in your games of cruel irony. And I think one of the best moments was in BioShock 1 when you take the elevator up and you see the woman with the cradle. And it's literally a cradle of life and there's a revolver in it. And it's just holy death. So I was wondering, what moments will you have in BioShock Infinite where you can kind of create that shadow on the wall while this woman is singing and make something as unthreatening as a splicer who has the same amount of power as you are and give it power over the player by frightening them?
I don't think there's anything worse in the world than when you see something positive, like you're going on your anniversary dinner with your girlfriend and you're all excited and you plan it and then she dumps your ass. I think that's that expectation of positiveness, something beautiful and something great, and then something terrible interjects itself into it. I think it's much more powerful than just sort of starting in a very negative place and getting worse and worse from there. So look, as I said before, my whole life is basically recreating Logan's Run over and over again. I remember they had this trailer which was this beautiful world where everybody has sex with everybody and everybody's beautiful and everything's free. There's one catch, you die at 30. And I that when I was a kid, that notion really struck with me, that mixture of the positive and the negative in the same place. And I've just been riffing on that forever.
Thanks. I think it's going to be our last question, and we'll wrap up.
Hey guys, so talking about villains, obviously decisions on how they feel have to be based in environment. And last year you spoke about your inspiration for where it's set, but I was curious, the first BioShock had definite ominous overtones like immediately, whereas this game is really bright and there's immediately a subtle layer of there's something very wrong underneath, which is almost the opposite, and I was wondering how you came to that decision to kind of just flip it the other way. And I find that much creepier than ominous overtones anyways, just that subtle feeling that there's something wrong under the surface, and it makes it feel more dangerous.
You know, I think it's really about, if you're just, you know we had a formula that worked, but that formula is not going to work again. You know, once you had done something specific, like we had done that and we had played that card, and I didn't think we could do it again. I don't think any of the team really wanted to do it again, because why is that challenging? And so, but whenever you do that, you open yourselves up to failure. You know, you open up yourselves up to doing something that people are not going to like. And look, you know, BioShock Infinite, it's not out yet. For all I know, it's like the worst game of all time. And you guys will be the ones who who tell us that. You know, the dangerous thing like this is like, you know, you do a talk like this, and it's like a victory lap. It's not a victory lap. We're not done yet. And this is all a bunch of theory that can be completely fucking wrong. And so, but if you're not taking risks, and I don't think this applies just to games, I think this applies to everybody in this room. You know, if you're not pushing yourself, if you're not taking risks, if you're not opening yourself up to new things and potentially failure, why get up in the morning?
So one last thing before we go, just sort of little housekeeping at the end. First thing is, if you look under your seat, 5 of you, or maybe the seat next to you if there's an empty seat, 5 of you will have an envelope that says congratulations on it. If you bring that up here afterwards, we have some signed limited edition lithographs from Columbia. And if you didn't get one, we're still celebrating Irrational's 15th birthday, so there are cupcakes for everybody on the way out.